Hi, this is Dr. Carolyn Coker Ross, bringing you the Inclusive Minds podcast. This podcast was inspired by the book of which I'm a co editor entitled Anti Blackness and the Stories of Authentic Allies Lived Experiences in the Fight Against Institutionalized Racism. If you're a psychologist, a social worker, an addiction professional, or a healthcare provider, or anyone who wants to broaden your horizons, then this podcast is for you. The goal of the podcast is to help you understand some of the more complex issues facing our culture today. My guests are experts in their fields, and we'll be talking about a wide array of topics, including cross-cultural issues, the intersection of race and trauma, social justice, and health inequities. They will be sharing both their lived experiences and their expert opinions. The goal is to give you a felt experience and to let you know that you're not alone in being confused by these complex issues. We want to provide nuanced information with context that will enable you to make your own decisions about these important topics. Welcome to the Inclusive Minds podcast. Today I have with me Gail Christopher, who is a very accomplished woman and a colleague. Dr. Gail Christopher is an award-winning social change agent and author with expertise in the social determinants of health and well-being and related public policies. She is a prolific writer and presenter. She's an author, co-author, and has contributed to 14 books, hundreds of articles, presentations, publications, and more. Her latest book is RX Racial Healing. She retired from her role as senior advisor and vice president at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, where she was the driving force behind the America Healing Initiative and the Truth Racial Healing and Transformation effort. In 1996, she was elected as a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. Dr. Christopher became a senior scholar at George Mason University Center for Advancement of Well-Being and executive director of the National Collaborative for Health Equity in 2019. In 2021, she was elected by the APHA Governing Council to serve as the APHA Honorary Vice President for the United States. Lest you think she's retired, in 2023, the American Journal of Health Promotion honored Dr. Christopher as one of the 10 most influential women scholars in health promotion. Wow. You've been busy.
I know, I'm call it workaholism, I guess, that's one way to
That's probably what our kids would call it, don't you think?
Yeah, they do. But I have a friend who retired recently, and she changed the term to rewired. I like that. She said
Instead of retired,
she said
rewired.
she
It's
rewired.
gonna take a lot to rewire people like you and me. I mean, we've been going for a long time. But I just wanna highlight that your bio hits a lot of hot button topics that are in the news lately, like, your work in health promotion and, truth, racial healing, and transformation. Just give me a little bit of a perspective, particularly in terms of your work in health promotion and, what we're seeing now with the appointment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to hit to the post. And I don't want to get into the weeds with politics, but just your perspective and how you have been feeling about that change.
I have been what used to be called an alternative health practitioner for all of my career. I've been, a licensed naturopath, napropath, and clinical nutritionist. So I've always understood that there is a mystery, there is a healing capacity within the human body
Yeah.
that we can support,
Mhm.
and that today's conventional medical interventions that are primarily pharmaceutical and surgical, they're just one part of the healing paradigm, as it were. And so we're in a moment of change, I believe, and there is the possibility that that we will take a giant step forward in terms of our relationship to the human body. And, so I'm feeling positive in the sense that I believe that our minds are more open. We have this tendency in this country to make everything a dichotomy. It's either this or it's that. It limits our capacity for, I believe, growth and understanding.
My hope is that we don't leave science behind when we take a giant leap. As you know, I did a fellowship with Andrew Weil's program in integrative medicine. And one of the big issues when I started in integrative medicine in 2004 was, can we bring science into naturopathy, integrative medicine, functional medicine, and so on, instead of just throwing supplements at it, which is no different than the current medical paradigm where we just throw medications at disorder. So, yeah, I agree with you that there's possibility, and there's also hopefully it won't go the other way where we leave science completely behind. But I want to talk about, you're one of the authors of the Anti-Blackness and the Stories of Authentic Allies, and you wrote a very interesting chapter that also hits on timely matters in terms of, racism and racial healing and that sort of thing. So I just want to ask you, why do you think racial healing is an important strategy and topic now, given the pushback on DEI and all of that?
Well, our language changes through the years. The focus has to be, I believe, on building a society that is capable of extending love and empathy and compassion to all.
Yeah.
We built this society, or this society was built on the basic fallacy of a hierarchy of human value. And we are in denial about the legacy of that fallacy.
Can you say more of that hierarchy of human values so everybody's on the same page with that?
You were back in the 1700s when, that era they called the Enlightenment. You had one particular, I believe he was a botanist, Linnaeus,
Mhm.
that created a false taxonomy of humanity. He hadn't traveled the world, but he knew there were lots of places in the world where people had come back with stories that were these diverse cultures, and there was African, there was native indigenous people the world over. And so he basically created this taxonomy, and he created many other taxonomies of many species, but of the human family he created this taxonomy which was hierarchical in nature, and it put white males at the top of this hierarchy. And of course, Black people were at the bottom, but you had all the other different types of people in between. And this became the basis of what was then called, what evolved to be called scientific racism. It became the justification for destruction and cruelty as it related to people who were not in that top category.
And
It
it was also the justification for slavery as well.
That's where I was going. It was the
Okay.
justification for the annihilation of indigenous people the world over. It certainly was the justification for enslavement of people from Africa in this country for the better part of 2.5 centuries. So this idea that there is, some difference in human species, that there's some difference in value, intrinsic value, it became the basis of our society, and we really haven't relinquished that.
And it's playing out in our public arena right now, basically, where
Mm.
white supremacy, which is that same part of that same doctrine, is trying to come to the forefront again.
And I don't use that term because I feel like every time we say that, we reinforce that fallacy. So that's why I try to get people to see it as part of a bigger fallacy that is antiquated, and it belongs back in the 17th century. That we are in the 21st century and we're still adhering to this nonsense, it's almost unbelievable.
Yeah.
But I discovered over the years that people will let that go, but they do it when they broaden their circles of engagement and they interact authentically with people who are different than themselves. And that's the basis of the RX racial healing methodology.
Yeah, and I wanna talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. I too have experience, I have been doing a lot of consulting in the health equity space and have seen what you talk about when people kind of share their own narratives with
Mhm.
each other. There's really kind of a communal feeling. We're all part of the human race kind of feeling. And yet the divides, the extreme divisions in our country now are really challenging that principle. How do you think that this RX racial healing and your experience with it can help overcome these extremely deep divisions in our country?
I believe that, and my experience is that if you bring people together for the purposes specifically of connecting at a heart level, the process that I've developed involves anywhere from 24 to 26 people in a circle. It is co-facilitated by two very different people who are modeling, if you will, this notion of difference not being a barrier to authentic communication.
Yeah.
And there's some resonance that happens. We divide into pairs and we have, into private discussions. We have prompts that people respond to. The prompts are always positive. The prompts are always a reminder of agency and the meeting of basic human needs, whether it's self-expression or security or agency. And then the group comes back together as a circle and they do deep listening to the stories that have been shared, and there is a electromagnetic, biological, biochemical, and physiological dynamic that happens in the circle that really does open the heart a
Yeah.
little more to this notion of our shared humanity. Now, don't get me wrong, there has been a manipulation and an exploitation of fear and racial division. There is a masterful manipulation, and of course, social media plays to that. We're in a very critical moment in our society today that is not very different from the Civil War era of the 1800s, and
Yeah.
the sense that this adherence to this need for superiority and control and the exploitation of the masses so that a few people's wealth can be protected. I mean, that's a political reality. We're in an era right now where political identity is the dominant tribal identity, as it were, in this country. And so if we could elevate and take to scale this attempt to build the connective tissue that will allow us to not be so easily manipulated politically, I think there's a crisis right now in our country that requires this kind of intentional work.
Why do you think political identity has superseded all of our other identity? It seems to even have superseded our identity as Americans even, you know?
Well, because it's been an intentional strategy to do that, and every major movement in the history of our country, whether it was the abolition movement to end slavery or the civil rights movement, that came about later to end Jim Crow, every major movement has been accompanied by a major shift in our mass communication. With abolition, it was newspapers. We had 3,000 newspapers in this country, and it made a big difference. With the
Yeah.
civil rights movement, it was television.
That's
With the New Deal, it was radio, and so now we have this new thing, social media, and unfortunately, it's a runaway train, and it's been exploited to create these political divisions.
Yeah.
Obama's administration, Obama's campaign was the first campaign that brought some sophistication to leveraging social media, but then it was usurped in the campaigns that followed. The other thing I would say about social media and the use of it, it has a much more addictive capacity. It literally changes the brain.
Yeah,
Uh,
nobody was addicted to newspapers, that's
right.
for sure.
And nobody was really addicted to television or
No.
you know what I mean? But this idea of having this phone in your hand or this computer, in your life, and the social media component really does pull you. It changes the brain, it increases the dopamine levels, it affects the actual functioning of the brain. And so that's how we got to this. When Elon Musk bought Twitter, he knew exactly what he was doing, and he turned it into his platform for communicating and building this base of extreme rhetoric. So it's a critical moment, and it's going to require sophisticated intervention.
How do you see this, your process, being spread across our very large country in a way that could shift the prevailing narrative that everybody's different and you're either on this side or that side and all of that?
We're coming at it from multiple directions. First of all, we engage universities and colleges. Right now, there's 75 college campuses around the country that are implementing this work on their campuses and within their communities.
Mm.
We've also engaged public health departments. We had over 250 public health departments in this country that have declared racism a public health crisis. We've engaged the libraries in this country. And then we have local communities that have embraced the process. So, but it's not where it needs to be, honestly. And after last night and, the 2 hours of what it was, I
You're
really.
talking last night when there was a State of the Union address?
Yes, yes. But it wasn't that. You know what I'm saying? It was more of the campaign rhetoric essentially that found its way rather than governance, rather than a union conversation about our country. It was more of the campaign rhetoric in that form.
They use the White House stage as a bully pulpit, they call it.
Well, but the content, from what I understand, was a continuation of the campaign rhetoric. And anyway, that's not important. What's important, though, is that we do have to have a counter narrative that focuses on our humanity, on our need for one another, on our interconnectedness as an expansive human family. And even though we have an annual day of racial healing that involves tens of thousands of folks every year, we had one this year, it's now in its 8th year. We still have not taken this to scale in such a way that it can immunize, if you will, us against the risk of extreme polarization and exploitation for personal gain.
What do you think would be a motivation that people could get behind to go back to racial healing? How do you see Americans who are backing away from this being motivated to, really return and be more solid with moving it forward?
At my organization, the National Collaborative for Health Equity, we do an annual poll that we call the Heart of America poll.
Okay.
Truthfully, most Americans are not what we're hearing and seeing in this moment, this politicized moment. Our poll results, which is a nationally representative poll, over 80% want us to be unified as a country. The ground is fertile. We just need someone who wants that as opposed to wanting division and wanting denial of the true history of our country. So it's unfortunate, in my view, that our recent election didn't produce a continued commitment to the healing. The last president used to call it healing the soul of America. But we have to recognize that there is a heartbeat in this country that wants unity, that wants healing. And somehow we have to find another leverage point, if you will, that prioritizes this. I don't know exactly what that fulcrum is, if you will, to help drive this healing work. I pray for that every night in terms of trying to figure out how we make it happen, particularly with the urgency and the scale that's needed right now.
You say 80% have a heart.
Yeah, and they want healing.
America.
Yep.
But a good proportion of those had to vote for the current administration in the last election. What was more important to them than their heart for healing?
Well, let's be clear in terms of breaking those percentages down. This was a close election. We have a flawed election system which emphasizes certain key states. Now, after all was said and done, the popular vote margin was very narrow, right? And so I just,
I'm just wondering, even given all of that, because I do believe Americans have good hearts, that we want the best for all of our people, and that the segment who are focused on, I don't know what you wanna substitute for the words white supremacy, but who are focused on that is pretty narrow, but good
yeah,
people, really good people, like the people in my group
uh-huh.
voted for this person who is
Well, I
image.
think it gets back to what I was saying about the social media and the false narratives. People were struggling with coming out of a pandemic. People were struggling economically, this notion of the price of eggs, right? And so people bought the hype that many people did, enough people did to give the margin of victory. People bought the hype. And of course, let's not ignore the deep subconscious biases that are at play in our society. And my research has indicated that the most entrenched bias that we have in America is ageism. And
Mhm.
so that was a factor, at
Oh,
least,
so true, yeah.
that was manipulated in terms of the incumbent president. And that was played very powerfully. And then we have, the gender bias. If we'd had our druthers, quite honestly, if we were being very strategic and very practical, I'm not sure we should have had a female running against, the current president because of the entrenched bias in this country that we haven't dealt with in terms of
It
gender hierarchy.
it showed up with Hillary
Yeah,
Clinton.
absolutely it did, and it was exploited to the nth degree.
Well, in my medical practice, I've been a physician, integrative medicine, addiction medicine, eating disorders, all of the mental health stuff, for a number of decades, let's say.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah, and
my central question from when I was a new baby doctor was, "What does it take to heal?" I still have that central question now kind of writ large in terms of what it sounds like you have the same kind of question, like, what does racial healing really take? And do you have any insight into what would it take to kind of turn the ship around?
I believe that the healing mechanism is natural, that our body is always healing,
Mhm.
that the same intelligence that creates the body in the womb, it heals the body after we are born. And
Okay.
so these healing mechanisms are natural, they are innate, they are inherent. However, the ethos, the condition that works against that is, of course, fear and threat, right? When we are in a state of fear, trauma, the perceived threat, certain parts of the brain, the amygdala, as you know, triggers the release of excessive hormones that work against our health and our well-being. That's on an individual level. We have created a society that is not informed optimally about these natural innate mechanisms, right? Then we don't understand what it costs us as a society to continue to adhere to this fallacy of a hierarchy of human value. So
Mm.
I feel like, and I believe in my heart that we have to shift our understanding as to what it is that contributes to our health and well-being. And living in a society that is divided and polarized and rooted in fear and antagonism, it's making us all sick. So that's my perspective as someone who is committed to reverence and respect and awe for the innate healing capacity that defines our being.
I wanna just ask you, how did your journey on this start? And I read a little bit in your chapter in the book about an experience you had at a camp when you were a
Mhm.
teenager.
I was blessed to have a summer at Chautauqua Institute. Now, Chautauqua became a publicly known place with the tragic shooting of the author there. I think it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, but Chautauqua was one of the first places in America that had these summer experiences of education and arts and culture, and I was given a fellowship to go there one summer from my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio. And like every major city, I grew up in a segregated community, and I'd never been outside of my segregated community until I went there. And my roommate happened to be white, and she was raised on the other side of town, right? I was on the east side, she was on the west side. And we became friends during the summer. You know, we had bunk beds and we talk about our families and our experiences. And I tell the story that at the end of the summer, it was almost over. We lived in these Victorian houses that were converted into dorms. And I was walking down the street and I saw an ambulance in front of our house. And I couldn't understand why an ambulance, so I ran to the house, and as I got to the house, they were carrying my roommate out on a stretcher, and I turned to the house parents to see what had happened, and they told me that my roommate, who was white, who had attempted suicide,
Oh my.
and I ran up to the room, that was my instinct, and sure enough, she had written a note to me, and the note said that, "I've come to know you over the summer, and my father, who happened to be a police officer in that city, right, of Cleveland, my father has taught me to hate Black people. I don't wanna go home. I don't wanna live that way anymore."
That's such a poignant story. Was that something that triggered your entire journey in this direction, do you think?
No, I think it did stay with me, you know? I've had many experiences as a Black woman that continued to build on my understanding that racism is so harmful. You know, I've lost family members, you know, so I have seen and felt and experienced the harm that racism causes. But I also had that early experience of that veil of separation having been pierced by this very innocent friendship of teenagers, right? And the effect it had on her personally in terms of this notion of racial hierarchy being challenged. But I think the most important thing was my journey as a holistic doctor. You know, when you work with people in a healing capacity, as you well know, you know, you realize who we are. You realize we're the same. We have, you know, we have the same organs. We have the same blood that flows through our veins. We have hearts that beat. We have this miracle of life. And these
And we have 99.9% the same DNA too.
no question, right? And so this notion that the superficial differences that were simply adaptations to the climates in which our ancestors evolved, that they should become the basis of societal organization and cruelty, we just know it's absurd.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, tell us a little bit about how we can get buy your book, RX Racial Healing: A Guide to Embracing Our Humanity.
Thank you so much for asking the question. And here's the book. It is published by and available through the American Association of Colleges and Universities, AACU. And if you go to their website, aacu.org, you can purchase the book, all of the proceeds from the sale of the book actually go to support the work that's happening on college campuses across the United States. So the
Excellent.
book really does help us to continue the work and keep this momentum expanding.
Yeah.
So I'm honored that I have this partnership with AACU, and we want to have many more college campuses, at least hundreds of college campuses, begin to create the next generation of people that recognize the fallacy of this hierarchy of human value and are committed. We have a movement we call Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. It is a truth and reconciliation process for this country, which may not come to fruition, over the next 4 years, but it's been gradually becoming a reality over the last 7 years at the local level. We had resolutions put forth in Congress by Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Senator Cory Booker to get a national effort. These things take time. It took 100 years to end and abolish slavery.
Yeah, everything does
Yeah.
take a lot of time. Well, it's just so fun to talk to you. I could talk to you all day.
Well, thank
Yeah.
you for the interview. Thank you for inviting me, and congratulations on the book itself.
And thank you so much for all of the work that you do. I think it takes people with optimism, which you clearly have, as well as people with reality in their corner to do this kind of work. It's very powerful. And I'm really excited to be talking to one of the 10 most influential women scholars in health promotion too.
Well, thank you very much. I'm always honored, but we're all in this together, and we'll all celebrate when the work is at least significantly done at a scale that's grand enough to
Yes.
change the political climate in this country.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the Inclusive Minds podcast so we can let you know when the next great guest comes on. The link to subscribe is in the caption below.